Autant je pense que sur les questions.
I think that on trade issues and the mechanism for future relations, which we're going to start on, we're going to rip each other apart. But that is part of negotiations.
Mais ça fait partie de la négociation.
The UK's top Brexit negotiator, David Frost, will be setting out Britain's position in a speech later today. For more on what to expect, let's go to Brussels to speak to our correspondent, Shona Murray. Morning to you, Shona. So, David Frost, who's he going to be talking to in this speech? And do we know at this point what he's going to say?
Well, Rosie, directly he'll be speaking at a university setting, to the ULB University in Brussels. But of course, he's going to be speaking to Michel Barnier, the whole of the EU 27 and anyone involved in the Brexit process. And he's expected essentially to elaborate on what we heard from Boris Johnson just 2 weeks ago when he set out his vision for the EU-UK future relationship, which is that the UK shouldn't be legally compelled in a treaty to abide by all the EU's regulations and standards when it comes to tax, environment, state subsidies and other areas, labour laws, for example, in order to get a proper comprehensive free trade agreement. He'll say that part of the object of Brexit was that the UK can set its own standards in these areas. And so then if they were to just abide by the EU's after leaving, then you'd have Brexit in name only. And he also make the point that, traditionally the UK has always been a leader when it comes to these standards. So to even suggest that it would sort of backslide in these areas is incorrect. Now, from the EU's point of view, they say we want to give a zero tariff, zero quota free trade agreement with the UK, but we have to make sure they're doing the same investment as the rest of us on environment, labour laws. Otherwise, they'll become an unfair competitor in the region. So it really is an aggressive opening gambit from the UK.
Well, aggressive is the right word, but that's from both sides. I mean, we heard what the French foreign minister said. Both sides are going to rip each other apart. Really strong language. Is it just tactics? Is it part of a strategy? Or is there actually a potential that they might be heading towards a no-deal scenario?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That language is incredibly aggressive. Incendiary, I think you probably would say. The context of it was yesterday from the French foreign minister was at the Munich conference, the security conference. And what he was saying was that he hoped in the future the UK would keep on the same track as the rest of the European Union and the rest of the EU when it comes to security and foreign policy. But on trade and the trade negotiations, that was going to get dirty. He was making that point. But it is true, and it is an incendiary remark, particularly at this very sensitive time. Now, when you speak to both sides, the UK side and the EU side, they both are steadfast that they won't move on this issue of level playing field, which is the sort of a catch-all term for these standards. The EU says it doesn't want any so-called dumping. It needs the UK to be a fair competitor. And as I said earlier, the UK said it has to be able to set its own rules. Otherwise, it's not its own country. And both sides have said that they are willing to walk away. I spoke to Commission sources last week and they said they'll just be returning to the sort of no-deal scenario planning that they did about a year ago before the withdrawal agreement was signed off. And the UK, for its part, has said similarly that they'll just have a diminished trading relationship with the EU, similar to that of Australia, which is essentially WTO terms. And both sides admit that nobody actually wants that and it's in no one's interests. But at this point, they're not willing to move.